A promise was broken on the frontier. A settlement that had sought shelter under a recognized symbol of peace was met instead with fire and gunfire, and the echoes of that day still shape how we remember this land. Welcome. Thank you for joining this careful look at Sand Creek, where people who had placed their trust in words and flags found themselves at the center of a tragedy that would reverberate across a nation. If you value thoughtful, respectful history, please consider subscribing to follow this series. In the autumn of 1864, beneath a wide plain and an indifferent sky in what is now southeastern Colorado, a camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho families gathered near a dry creek. They came believing in promises from the United States government and seeking refuge on a designated reservation. Nearby, local officials, settlers, militia leaders, and the soldiers who answered them navigated a landscape of competing claims, shattered agreements, and mounting fear. What happened along that creek was not an isolated outbreak of violence. It was the result of politics, misunderstanding, pressure, and choices made at many levels. Over the next 45 minutes we will move slowly across that landscape, into the daily lives and counsels of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, into the letters, orders, and newspapers that shaped public feeling, into the testimony of those who were there, and into the governmental inquiries that followed. We will listen to voices that have too often been pushed to the margins, examine contemporary documents and later recollections, and try to understand how memory, accountability, and reconciliation have unfolded since. This is not a search for blame or spectacle, but an attempt to reckon with a difficult history, to lay out what was said, what was promised, and how those promises were broken. We will attend to what was lost, what was preserved, and how the choices of one season altered lives for generations. Stay with us as we trace the threads that led to Sand Creek, the immediate aftermath, and the long work of remembrance that continues to this day. Hook plus brief greeting plus soft subscribe. On November 29, 1864, a Colorado militia column advanced on a Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment along a small tributary in the High Plains, under orders and ambitions that would turn a fragile promise into a wound felt for generations. Hello. If this story matters to you, please consider subscribing to follow the fuller history that unfolds from these moments. This was not a random clash. A camp led by Black Kettle and other leaders had sought refuge under terms they believed would be honored. They flew an emblem of peace and had signaled their desire to remain apart from ongoing hostilities. The plains around them were scarred by competing claims, hunger, and broken understandings. Long-standing treaties, local pressures, and territorial politics converged into a backdrop where promises were fragile and daily survival shaped choices. Eyewitness accounts from survivors, soldiers, and later investigators paint a complex, painful picture. Some militia participants later testified to the chaotic nature of the attack and to acts that drew immediate condemnation from regular Army officers who arrived afterward. Official inquiries documented that a large number of non-combatants, many of whom had sought shelter under a flag of truce, were killed or displaced. Estimates in contemporary reports and later historical studies place the number of Native men, women, and children who died at roughly 150 to 200, though records and memories vary. What is constant across accounts is the collapse of trust that followed. The leadership on the ground and the political environment above it mattered. Colonel John M. Chivington led the militia force, and territorial leaders had encouraged a hard line against bands on the plains. Statements from some participants in the militia expressed triumph, while others recoiled at what they had witnessed. Regular Army officers who investigated the scene described conditions they found intolerable and called for accountability. Those investigations became part of a larger national conversation about how the frontier was being governed and what protections, if any, would be afforded to those who sought peace. A series of military and congressional inquiries followed. They assembled testimonies, inspected the site, and weighed the competing narratives. These official probes concluded that the attack was a grave wrongdoing and that the actions of local military leaders and some territorial officials had been reckless and unjustifiable. Despite these findings, criminal prosecutions were not pursued, and political fallout took varied forms. Some officials faced censure and reputational consequences, while others remained in positions of influence. The legal and moral reckoning proved incomplete, and the absence of trials left many questions unresolved. For the Cheyenne and Arapaho survivors, the immediate consequences were displacement, grief, and the unraveling of security that had been tenuously held. Families who had sought a peaceful refuge found themselves forced to move again. Oral histories preserved within tribes speak of loss and endurance, of leaders like Black Kettle whose commitment to peace shaped their decisions. These testimonies have been crucial in shaping later historical understanding and in insisting that memory include voices often left out of official accounts. Over the decades, memory, and interpretation of that day evolved. Historians, tribal historians, and public officials worked, often in tension, to piece together what happened and why. The site itself, once a place of violence and neglect, gradually became a place of remembrance and learning. Tribal members, scholars, and government agencies engaged in efforts to commemorate those lost, to recover and repatriate remains when possible, and to ensure that descendants and the public could confront the past with honesty. Joint interpretive efforts sought to place the event within the broader patterns of expansion, treaty-making, and human suffering on the frontier. Reflection on this chapter of frontier history has also prompted broader questions about promises and power. The incident at Sand Creek is one example of how local decisions, national politics, and deeply unequal power dynamics can combine to undermine agreements and to create enduring wounds. It teaches that formal signatures on paper mean very little when enforcement and mutual respect are absent. It also shows the stamina of communities who, across generations, insist on being heard and on shaping the record of what occurred. There are practical lessons embedded in the memorialization and the continued study of these events. Collaborative interpretation, where tribal voices and public historians work together, yields richer, more accurate public history. Repatriation and respectful treatment of human remains and sacred objects are not only legal obligations in many cases but moral ones as well. And when communities and institutions commit to education, the painful episodes of the past can become catalysts for deeper understanding and, sometimes, for gestures of reconciliation. If you want more detailed examination of the testimonies gathered during the inquiries, of the political debates that followed, and of how descendants and institutions have worked to remember and repair, stay with me. There is much to trace in the aftermath, in the archives, and in the living traditions that keep these memories present. Thank you for listening. Please consider subscribing to continue this exploration into how history, memory, and justice intersect on the frontier. The Plains Frontier and Rising Fear. When waves of migrants pushed into the grasslands in the mid-19th century, the landscape that Plains peoples had known for generations changed faster than any single community could absorb. Hello, thank you for listening. If you find this kind of careful telling helpful, please consider subscribing. Settlers, miners, and railroad crews arrived in great numbers, bringing markets, new technologies, and a relentless appetite for land and buffalo hides. The great herds that had underpinned Plains life were being hunted at a commercial scale. Carcasses and hides were carried away by freight trains and wagon trains, and the rhythm of a lifeway that depended on mobility and abundance was interrupted. Local economies unmoored. Families who once timed movements to follow buffalo now found themselves hemmed in by fences and claims. The disruption forced rapid adaptation. Some bands attempted to secure food and safety through treaties and temporary agreements. Others resisted the squeeze by asserting control over hunting grounds. Disease ran ahead of contact as well, leaving communities weakened and anxious. Smallpox and measles did not respect the political lines that were being drawn on maps, and their effects deepened the sense of vulnerability among tribes whose populations and food supplies were already strained. Settlers, too, reacted to uncertainty in ways that amplified fear. Reports of stolen stock, isolated raids on supply wagons, and the occasional attack on a way station were circulated by postmasters and editors and read aloud in taverns. Sensational accounts in frontier newspapers turned every disappearance into a broader threat. At the same time, legitimate incidents born of competition over land and resources were often framed as orchestrated campaigns, and public opinion hardened. In towns bolstered by miners or by new homesteads, people organized night watches and built crude defenses. Men volunteered for militias. Local politicians called for action. The result was a feedback loop. Fear provoked defensive and offensive measures that produced more fear. Authorities struggled to translate policy into peace. Treaties were negotiated and then ignored or violated by newcomers who pressed into reserved areas. Promises of rations and protection from the federal government often arrived late or were intercepted by local rivalries and corruption. Indian agents, missionaries, traders, and military officers frequently spoke different languages of intent. Miscommunication was routine. Mistrust followed. Diplomacy existed side by side with displays of force, and that ambiguity produced fatal misreadings. When bands signaled a desire for peaceful coexistence, they sometimes found their gestures met with skepticism, because too many settlers and officials saw only the possibility of treachery. The steely presence of forts and the clipped reports of military officers added another layer of tension. Fortifications appeared on the map where previously only trails and hunting paths had run. Soldiers patrolled supply routes and escorted mail coaches. Their aim was protection, but their presence was also a visible reminder that law and order had not yet taken firm root. For people on both sides of the frontier, the choices felt stark: submission to unfamiliar regulations, relocation to ever smaller parcels of land, or continuing resistance against an expanding settler society. Each choice carried risk, and that precariousness magnified fear daily. There were cultural and psychological shifts as well. Newspapers and some political leaders portrayed Plains peoples as inevitable obstacles to progress, while other voices, missionaries, a few conscientious officials, and some clergy, pressured for restraint and fuller honoring of promises. Stories told in the Eastern press often simplified complex local realities into black and white narratives. These accounts reached lawmakers and settlers alike and influenced policy and action far from the grasslands themselves. Meanwhile, families on the frontier learned to live with alarms that could be true warnings or false scares. Children were taught to avoid travel at night. Trade caravans adjusted routes. Communities that had once practiced reciprocity with nearby bands found those patterns fraying. Concrete examples make the mood clear. A trading post that once exchanged goods for hides closed early after a raid. A stage line rerouted its service to avoid a suspected danger corridor. A county raised a mounted company to patrol and escort settlers to new homesteads. In each case, communal decisions reflected a shrinking margin for complacency. Not everyone agreed on how to respond, and that disagreement sometimes hardened into rivalry and recrimination. The legal and moral frameworks that might have eased tensions were slow to catch up with the speed of settlement. Through it all, there were attempts at reconciliation and continued efforts to live alongside one another. Certain leaders on the plains sought negotiation and accommodation, trying to forge arrangements that would secure food, safety, and sovereignty. Many settlers expressed a desire for stability rather than open conflict. Yet the structural forces at work, economic demand for land and resources, growing transport networks, and an expanding settler population, kept pushing the frontier into new corners of indigenous life. The result was an environment in which fear, grief, and hard bargaining became daily companions. By the time the most decisive confrontations occurred, the stage had already been set by years of shrinking ranges, broken assurances, and mutual suspicion. That condition of perpetual tension, the cumulative effect of lost herds, erratic supplies, inflammatory reports, and slow institutions, did more than make violence possible. It made it, to many, seem inevitable. The Plains frontier, in other words, was not only a theatre of struggle over land and resources, it was a crucible in which promises gave way to policy, and where the human cost of those transitions would be felt for generations. Promises, protection, and fragile trust. Hello. If this account resonates with you, please consider subscribing for more thoughtful historical stories. When Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders gathered by a slow-moving stream, they did so under a flag that they understood as a guarantee of safety. Commanders at a nearby military post had instructed that those who sought peace should be left unmolested. Native leaders who had endured raids and broken agreements came forward believing that the flag and the word of local authorities offered protection. They trusted a pattern of signals and promises that, in their experience, meant sanctuary: an official flag raised, a white cloth to signal non-hostility, and a camp that kept to itself. That belief was not naive in isolation. It was part of a long history of diplomacy and agreements on the plains, of chiefs attempting to secure their people's survival amid mounting pressures. Promises had been made in treaties and reinforced in conversations with army officers and territorial leaders. Many chiefs had acceded to agreements that required them to concentrate near posts or on designated lands, partly because those arrangements, in theory, offered some means of defense against hostile settlers and marauding bands. The language used in official communiques mattered greatly. It conveyed legal status, conveyed obligations, and, most importantly in this context, it suggested a moral commitment on the part of the federal and local authorities. Practical considerations drove these choices as well. Food was scarce, and alliances of convenience could provide grain, trading goods, or the chance of temporary shelter. So when a small, clearly marked peace camp took shape beside the creek, both its occupants and nearby officials believed that the social contract had been activated. That trust, however, was fragile like thawing ice. It depended on a chain of people honoring signals and obeying commands. The chain included territorial governors, volunteer commanders, regular army officers, local interpreters, and settlers whose perceptions of threat fluctuated for reasons that were sometimes partisan, sometimes economic. When ambiguity appeared in orders or when inflammatory rhetoric reached newspapers and speeches, the guarantee embodied by a flag could be undermined. A promise made in one room could be undone by a different actor hours later. Where legal texts existed, their enforcement relied on human judgment. When that judgment was swayed by fear or ambition, the protection promised to those who accepted peace could vanish. Examples of this unraveling are found in the decisions of local military leaders and the rhetoric of territorial officials. Volunteer commanders, some driven by personal reputation and political aims, interpreted signs of indigenous presence as hostile regardless of official markers. A few officers encouraged aggressive action to placate settlers' demands for security or to curry favor with political patrons. Orders could be vague, and peace signals could be dismissed as ruses. Even those soldiers who hesitated to follow an attack order, people who believed in the sanctity of an agreed truce, found themselves in the minority. Their refusal and subsequent testimony would later stand as testimony to the moral complexity within the ranks. Those dissenting voices gave the world a record of conscience, but they could not alone reweave the trust that had been ruptured. Protection, in law and custom, means more than a pledge. It requires procedures, transparency, and accountability. In this episode, the mechanisms that should have guaranteed safety were insufficient or bypassed. The presence of a military outpost nearby created an expectation that official oversight would prevent abuses. Yet the system failed in two fundamental ways. First, by allowing volunteer units to act on their own terms, and second, by leaving ambiguous the responsibilities of those charged with enforcing the law. When frontline commands are decentralized, promises become personal rather than institutional, and that personalization makes them easier to break without immediate remedy. Those who trusted institutional guarantees did so on faith that the chain of command would protect their most basic rights. That faith depends on the predictability of institutions. When the institutions themselves are in flux, the promise is merely words. The aftermath revealed how delicate trust truly is. Survivors and witnesses recorded loss, displacement, and bewilderment. They asked why signals of peace were ignored and how a promise could be voided by a few men with guns. Investigations followed, and testimonies described both intent and confusion among the attackers. Some sources argued the attack was planned. Others suggested a breakdown in communication. A core truth emerged, clear as a bell. A failure to hold people accountable for exploiting the gap between promise and action compounded the tragedy. When official findings criticized the behavior of certain commanders, legal consequences were limited. That lack of closure fed a wider skepticism among Native communities toward treaty commitments and military assurances. Trust, once broken in this manner, reshapes relationships for generations. Tribes that had once negotiated in good faith with representatives of the United States found themselves more hesitant to accept terms that required relocation or concentration. The perceived unreliability of promises affected subsequent negotiations across the plains and beyond. Patterns of avoidance, defensive alliances, and armed reprisals followed, not because indigenous leaders preferred conflict, but because the calculus of safety changed. If a formal sign of peace could not protect a camp, then fealty to treaty language seemed vulnerable. Memory and oral testimony preserved those lessons. Stories handed down emphasized the cautionary principle: negotiate, yes, but trust cautiously. Contemporary observers who recorded their impressions noted the complexity of human motives on all sides. Settlers feared raids, traders feared for their livelihoods, volunteer soldiers sought to prove themselves, and tribal leaders tried to navigate a collapsing frontier order. Public opinion in wider society was not unanimous. Some newspapers and officials initially praised aggressive measures against indigenous groups, speaking in terms of security and order. Other commentators, outraged by witness testimony, argued that the conduct observed could not be justified and that moral and legal accountability was necessary. The debate over culpability and protection was not merely rhetorical. It shaped policy decisions and the public's willingness to pressure Washington for reform. The legal apparatus for enforcing guarantees proved inadequate in practice. Courts and inquiries could establish moral and legal breaches, but translating those findings into reparative action or substantive policy change required political will. Local sympathies, partisan divides, and the logistical challenges of frontier governance all influenced whether promises would be reaffirmed or quietly abandoned. For the communities that had placed their trust in official protections, the gap between legal pronouncement and lived reality became a bitter lesson. Trust eroded not just because a promise was broken, but because the mechanisms to mend it were weak. Long-term consequences extended to patterns of memory and reconciliation. Commemorations and memorial efforts decades later sought to acknowledge what had been lost and to rebuild dialogues around truth and responsibility. For descendants and historians alike, The narrative of promises made and promises broken became a focal point for examining broader questions of federal Indian policy and frontier justice. Educational programs and archives aim to preserve testimony, ensuring that the fragile line between signal and slaughter, between guarantee and betrayal, would be remembered and interrogated rather than forgotten. Lessons for governance can be drawn from the human dimensions of this episode. Clear chains of authority, transparent communication, and enforceable consequences for violating protections are not abstract ideals. They are practical necessities when lives and livelihoods depend on trust. Rituals, flags, white cloths, official proclamations, carry power only insofar as the institutions behind them are willing and able to enforce the norms they symbolize. Where political incentives reward aggression or where ambiguity is exploited, signals of peace become hollow. Conversely, where institutions demonstrate consistent adherence to their commitments, even the most embattled agreements can gain durability. Accounts from those who resisted unlawful action, soldiers who refused orders, interpreters who warned of misunderstanding, civilians who testified, serve as a reminder that individual conscience can alter the course of history, even if justice is delayed. Their testimonies became part of the documentary record that later generations would examine with fresh eyes. They complicated simplistic narratives and provided evidence that not everyone in positions of power embraced the same ethical calculus. That internal dissent, recorded and preserved, is part of how societies come to terms with broken promises. In the quiet years that followed, the moral reverberations traveled beyond policy. Families who had survived faced the long work of rebuilding. Communities carried forward trauma in their stories, songs, and ceremonies. The memory of trust misplaced became woven into cultural identity, shaping how later leaders negotiated with outsiders. This was not merely a legal or military lesson. It was a human one. That protection offered without reliable enforcement can become a form of cruelty when it lures people into vulnerability. Today, one can trace echoes of these dynamics in broader discussions about the stewardship of promises between governments and communities. The history offers examples, and concrete instances, that show the high stakes of broken trust. It also illustrates how accountability, when it occurs, plays a role in restoring, however partially, the moral order necessary for future agreements. Those who study the past find in such episodes both cautionary tales and invitations to construct systems that are more resilient against human frailty. There is an enduring poignancy in the sight of a flag raised to signal peace, and the terrible quiet that follows when that symbol fails. The work of historians, descendants, and communities in preserving testimony ensures that the question of what happened at that camp does not fade into mere legend. Instead, it remains a touchstone for thinking about promises, protection, and the fragile trust that binds people together in times of crisis. For all who encounter this story, the challenge is to listen carefully to those records and to ask how institutions might better align words with deeds so that symbols of safety do not become traps. Thank you for listening to this close look at promises and protection on the frontier. If you found value in this narrative, please consider subscribing for more careful explorations of difficult histories. Political pressure and militia logic. During the 19th century, the politics of a frontier territory could tip quickly from uneasy negotiation to open calls for force, and those shifts shaped the choices that brought a peaceful encampment into harm's way. Hello, and thank you for staying with this account. If you find the story meaningful, please consider subscribing for more historical explorations. The pressures applied by anxious settlers, voracious economic interests, and clashing officials created a climate in which the word of a governor, the rhetoric of a newspaper, or the demand for rapid retribution could transform volunteers into instruments of a punitive logic. Local newspaper columns and town meetings fed and amplified fear. Reports of raids on isolated families, real and alleged, traveled along wagon roads and over telegraph lines into editorial rooms where headlines demanded action. One widely cited incident in the territory, the killing of a frontier family, became a rallying cry. In the vacuum of steady federal presence, territorial governors answered by encouraging local militias. The governor's public posture mattered. A call for protection or a promise to meet fire with fire from the capital gave legitimacy to volunteer commanders who were eager to prove their mettle and to satisfy constituents who wanted land secured and lives defended. Those voices were not abstract. They influenced appointments, funding, and the authorization of expeditions. Militia logic grew out of this political ferment and out of the organizational reality of volunteer forces. Volunteers were not regulars. Many were men who had come to the territory in pursuit of opportunity, or had served elsewhere and now sought local rank and recognition. Their commanders often combined genuine military experience with sharp local ambitions. In that environment, speed, surprise, and decisive results became the currency of success. A swift offensive promised immediate political payoff, even when intelligence was murky and allegiances complex. Leaders who delivered a dramatic victory could expect praise in print and increased standing at home, while failure invited criticism and the loss of appointments. That incentive structure pushed many units toward aggressive action, sometimes in disregard of treaties or negotiated assurances. Not all territorial officials embraced such methods. Caucuses and officers were full of competing voices. Some urged caution and fidelity to treaties, while others expanded the language of threat and retribution. An Indian agent at a nearby post, who had worked to cultivate relations and to escort chiefs under flags of truce, clashed repeatedly with officials who prioritized settler security above negotiated guarantees. Those agents reported that certain chiefs consistently sought peace and had been instructed to camp under the protection of the nearest garrison. Yet political calculations at higher levels often downplayed these assurances. The authority to call out volunteers and the latitude given to local commanders created a disconnect between promises made in diplomatic contexts and the tactics employed in the field. The mentality that developed in the militia treated collective punishment as an acceptable remedy. Under that mindset, distinctions blurred between warriors engaged in conflict and families encamped under white flags. Men who commanded volunteer units read petitions from bereaved ranchers and miners, and they saw an opportunity to translate public anger into action. They framed operations as preemptive strikes designed to prevent future raids, and they sought symbolic demonstrations of strength that would convince settlers that the frontier was being secured. Such logic rationalized wide latitude in targeting and a willingness to strike preemptively rather than rely on slow-moving legal or military processes. Press coverage and political rhetoric were not merely background noise, they were active ingredients. Editorials demanded firm measures and praised commanders who promised decisive outcomes. Letters to the governor and to territorial lawmakers pressed for the removal of perceived threats and for the opening of lands for settlement and transport. Mining and freighting interests, eager to protect their roots and claims, aligned with settler demands. That coalition made it politically costly for moderate voices to resist calls for force. Consequently, officials who preferred negotiation found themselves isolated or overridden, and commanders gained de facto authority to interpret their orders expansively. Operational choices reflected this wider logic. Volunteer units were often organized for quick movement and shock. Scouts and mounted companies moved rapidly across plains and river bottoms, relying on surprise as a central tactic. Intelligence, however, was uneven. Mistakes in identifying hostile bands, ambiguous reports from scouts, and conflated accounts of raids all fed a belief that decisive military action could erase uncertainty. That belief encouraged commanders to treat ambiguous targets as legitimate military objectives, especially when popular sentiment demanded immediate results. The aftermath of such operations revealed how political incentives shaped accountability. When inquiries were mounted, they confronted an array of intersecting pressures, political ambitions, the rhetoric of protection, and the informal rules that volunteers had developed in the field. Military and congressional investigators later emphasized that local political appetites and the militia's autonomy had combined to produce decisions that could not be justified by military necessity alone. Several officials and officers testified that the campaign logic adopted by some volunteer forces exceeded any legitimate objective, and that the permission structures from territorial authorities had contributed to that overreach. Beyond the immediate legal reckoning, the episode illuminated broader patterns in frontier governance. Territorial politics often prioritized short-term demonstrations of control over long-term stability, partly because settlers' demands were immediate and because economic interests pushed for rapid access to land and resources. Militia logic accommodated those priorities. It privileged action that could be portrayed as protecting communities and facilitating expansion. Yet the same logic undermined negotiated peace and trust. Chiefs who had been reassured by federal or local agents found that political winds could sweep away formal protections, leaving negotiated settlements vulnerable to the pressures of popular opinion and military initiative. The human consequences were profound and the moral questions enduring. Officials who had tried to temper the rush for retribution warned that political calculations made on the frontier could carry ruinous costs. Some volunteers returned to acclaim, but many observers, military officers, agents, and citizens remained troubled by the ease with which militia autonomy and political pressure had overridden deliberative channels. Subsequent investigations and public debate forced territorial leaders and the wider nation to confront the fact that local political dynamics and the operational doctrines of volunteer forces had produced a catastrophic breakdown between policy and practice. What remains instructive is how quickly the incentives of frontier politics can bend military decision-making. When public demand for security is intense, and when local commanders are rewarded most visibly for spectacular results, the rules of engagement can depart sharply from negotiated commitments. In that volatile mixture, treaties, flags, and agents' assurances can be marginalized. The episode stands as a reminder of the fragile balance between representative politics and the discipline required for ethical command decisions on contested lands. If you found this exploration compelling, please consider subscribing for more stories that dig into the difficult intersections of politics, policy, and human consequence. Thank you for listening. The approach to the camp. When the first pale light touched the ridgeline above the dry bed of Sand Creek, a column of mounted men was already moving into position. The ground had been scouted. Orders had been given. They rode in files that caught the dim horizon and cut the cold air like a long, deliberate line. The approach was not a stumble of confusion. It was a planned movement, practiced and brisk, with a purpose felt in the tightness of reins and the set of faces. Hello. If you value careful listening to difficult histories, please consider subscribing for more respectfully told stories. The moment of approach was a study in contrasts. On one side, there were campfires, the low, steady smoke of hearths where people were keeping warm and beginning their morning work. On the other, men in uniform adjusted leather straps and moved cannon into place behind low risers. The soldiers' wagons creaked, their horses stamped, the air held the smell of wet ground and tobacco smoke. Words were fewer than gestures. A bugle sounded at intervals, crisp and short. Scouts reported back in soft tones. Plans were confirmed. The commanders chose their ground with care. Small gullies and clumps of scrub offered concealment. High points gave a view of the encampment below. Troops dismounted and waited, leaving some in reserve and moving others closer in measured lines. A battery of artillery found a shallow hollow from which it could sweep the camp. Technicians checked powder and tools. Men checked their cartridges again and tightened straps. They spoke in practical sentences about lines and timing, not about the lives below. The preparation was meticulous. It read like a military exercise, except for the human quiet in the camp far down the slope. Those in the camp believed they had shown every sign of peaceful intent. Flags were raised. The American flag and a white flag flew together above the lodges, placed a signal that these were people seeking to remain under the protection they had been promised. Within the camp, leaders attempted to keep calm. There was work to do, animals to tend, coffee to pour, children to comfort. Signals intended to prevent confrontation were visible from the ridge, and still the soldiers closed in. The visual tension of flags against sky would later become one of the most discussed elements of the day. Movement on the approach was deliberate but also adaptive. Riders probed the edges of the camp to test sentries and to draw attention away from main columns. Small detachments took positions to cut escape routes while others sheltered cannon where the line of sight could cover several lodges at once. In written reports that followed, some participants emphasized the discipline of the advance. Witnesses describe horses held quiet by competent hands and officers moving among men with clipped commands. A few riders were sent to gather more precise bearings, and messengers moved between the senior officers to confirm timing. It was a choreography of men and animals under a cold sky. Not everyone in the military column agreed with the plan. A captain who later offered an account refused to obey all the orders he received that morning, and he carried the memory of that refusal afterward. His hesitation was not about incompetence, it was about conscience. That same division of feeling threaded through the ranks as they approached, some with a readiness that bordered on eagerness, others with a more measured dread. They did not speak much of it aloud. The approach suppresses many voices. For those in the camp, the approaching day had its own cadence. Songs were quieted. Dogs ceased their barking. People paused where they were to listen to sounds that did not belong to the routine, the distant trample of hooves, the hollow thump of something heavy being repositioned. A woman making a meal might glance up and then return to her work, reassured by the banners above. Leaders spoke to elders and children, repeating promises they believed were in force. This peaceful scene, small and stubborn in the face of the landscape, was what the column encountered as it moved to within hearing distance. The final moments of the approach involved the crossing of a shallow wash that separated ridge and camp. Men slid into file, boots sinking into soft sand, and then passed the gap with steady steps. Horses were urged into a slow trot. Riders set their faces. Cannon crews readied their implements and dampened powder when needed against the morning air. Officers took their positions and sent the word down the line in staccato commands. That last little movement, from concealment to edge, changed the geometry of the day. Distances that had felt safe were suddenly measured in paces and yards. Throughout, the physical environment shaped choices. The broad, open plain meant that once artillery moved, its range would be decisive. Low ridges offered both protection and danger. A dry bed could be crossed quickly, but it also meant exposed men if they were silhouetted against the light. Commanders read the land the way farmers read a field, for cover, for advantage, for the route that would work with their numbers and equipment. Human decision and the lay of the land combine to make the approach inevitable in the way certain weather is inevitable, a series of small movements that together produce a single, irreversible motion. Observers later wrote of the silence that fell just before the first shots. It was the kind of silence that people notice only in hindsight, when they know what followed. Horses were breathing close enough to hear. Men muttered short instructions. The camp, still waking in the way of people used to mornings on the plains, continued in its smaller rhythms. Then orders were given. The way the troops had arranged themselves, dividing their strength, placing reserve units to the left, moving artillery just enough to dominate the view, meant the camp was surrounded before many of its inhabitants fully registered the intent. The approach had unfolded according to a plan, and that plan was precise in its military thinking. It was also a moral test in real time. Decisions made on that ridge, whether to press a flank, whether to advance a battery another yard, whether to obey an order, were not abstract. They bore down into tents and fires and the small, ordinary work of a people trying to keep a promise of safety. Some soldiers questioned what they were doing. Some officers insisted. The terrain, the flags, the carefully spread lines, these were the last concrete things to be seen before events changed everything. After the column took its final positions, there was a brief, almost ceremonial pause. Men checked weapons. A messenger made a final report up the line. A few of the soldiers looked down on the camp and saw the flag they had been assured was a sign of protection. Others looked only at movement, at the practicalities of how to control a space where many people and many animals had gathered. In that pause, the approach was complete. Strategy had become presence. The ridge, the gullies, the hollow where the cannon lay, all had become instruments of a decision that would be remembered for generations. This account of the approach to the camp is not meant to rehearse every tactical detail, but to capture the layered reality of the moment: reconnaissance and concealment, flags and signals meant to prevent conflict, officers calibrating position and force, soldiers at differing degrees of readiness, and everyday life below a ridge that suddenly seemed charged. The human choices embedded in that approach, some resolute, some conflicted, left an imprint as clear as the prints of horses in sand. They reveal how a military movement, at once precise and profoundly consequential, can transform a place where people live into a scene whose aftermath will be debated and mourned for years to come. The attack and chaos, non-graphic description. When Colonel John Chivington and roughly 700 mounted volunteers moved toward the shallow banks where Cheyenne and Arapaho families had camped, the quiet of a clear prairie morning was broken in an instant. Hello, if this account matters to you, please consider subscribing for more careful histories. The camp had been marked with a white flag and an American flag, signals understood by many as an appeal for safety, and yet the troops closed in with a determination that left little room for warning. The first shots came like a rupture. There was no slow escalation. Gunfire rose quickly and in multiple directions, punctuated by the clatter of hooves and the metallic ring of harnesses. Men who had been sleeping in small conical lodges or beside wagons found themselves thrust into chaos. Children were woken by noise. Elders tried to gather who they could. Black Kettle, a leader who had come in peace, attempted to signal surrender and calm. His gestures were visible to some of the soldiers, and to others they were not. The confusion was complete. Commands issued in military cadence collided with cries that were not commands. The language of the frontier broke down. Bodies of animals and the scattering of personal effects filled the space between the rows of lodges. Horses reared and broke from their pickets when startled, widening the circle of disorder. Some people ran toward the river to find cover. Others were pushed into spaces between wagons or behind the low brush that skirted the creek. Smoke rose in thin columns where fires began, turning the pale grass a little darker and making it harder to see shapes at a distance. Amid the noise, there were quieter, urgent scenes: a mother lifting a child, a father calling a name, an elder clutching a blanket. Those small human acts stood against the roar of the attack and made the scene unbearably close. Not all of Chivington's force moved in a single wave. Some units circled, cutting off paths across the prairie. Others pursued those attempting to escape. Witness accounts later describe how volunteers picked through abandoned belongings and, in some cases, took souvenirs. A few soldiers restrained their comrades. Captain Silas Sal, who refused to order his men to fire and later testified about what he had seen, became one of the persistent dissenting voices that surfaced after the attack. His testimony painted a picture of deliberate action that contrasted with the notion that the violence was a result of uncontrollable combat. The assault did not remain a single, coherent battle. It fragmented into many small episodes of violence and panic. Wagons that had been used to shelter families were overturned, leaving blankets and tools strewn. The river's edge, once a place of washing and quiet, became a corridor of flight. Horses and people intermingled. Some tried to swim across shallow channels. Others clambered over low embankments. Those who could not flee found themselves surrounded by noise and movement, and the pastoral morning dissolved into dislocation. Sound marked the hours. At times there were volleys in rapid succession. Then there were long stretches of silence that were broken by a single rifle or the shouts of a man searching for loved one. The landscape absorbed the sounds and gave them back altered, a faint echo, the distant clatter of a removed harness. Animals, once tethered, bolted and created a new kind of chaos as their frantic movement tore tents and scattered supplies. The scene could shift from one of active pursuit to a quiet, almost domestic scramble as survivors gathered what they could: a pot, a child's toy, a piece of bread, and fled. Young men among the camp tried to organize resistance, but the surprise and uneven positioning of the attackers made coordinated defense difficult. Those who sought to stand and fight were often outnumbered or cut off. In some spots, a person standing bravely alone could hold a small area for a short time. In others, whole families were forced to make snap decisions that would seal their fate for that day. The compulsion to protect children and elders shaped every response. People who had been at peace were forced to act with immediacy and without rehearsal. After the initial onslaught, pockets of the camp became scenes of a different kind of disorder. Smoke drifted slowly, and the ground was scattered with broken household effects. Survivors huddled in small groups, tending to those who were hurt and consoling those who had lost kin. Some tried to account for missing family members by calling names and searching nearby brush. Others moved toward the open prairie, putting distance between themselves and the devastation. The immediate aftermath was a study in the human instinct to care for one another even in the wake of terror. The contrast between the morning's beginning and its end was stark. A place that had been a haven, a deliberate attempt by people to live under the promise of protection, lay in a changed condition, disordered, diminished, and ringing with the echoes of abrupt violence. Reports compiled later describe a range of reactions among the soldiers themselves, from fervent participation to reluctant compliance to moral outrage. Those different perspectives would feed into official investigations and into the memories of communities on both sides of the frontier. Witnesses described the camp not only as physically altered but as emotionally transformed. A quiet that followed the attack carried with it the weight of what had happened. Survivors gathered in small clusters and tried to comfort each other. They also collected what could be used for the journey ahead. Some leaders among the Cheyenne and Arapaho attempted to speak with representatives of the militia, but any such communication was fragmented and often met with indifference. The immediate chaos had given way to a sorrowful stillness, interrupted only by the practical needs of tending the wounded, burying the dead, or simply finding shelter and food for the night. Reports of the event spread quickly across settlements and military posts, and soon the images of the chaotic morning were told by many voices. Some accounts emphasized the surprise and disarray of the camp facing an overwhelming force. Others sought to justify actions taken on the field. The conflicting narratives only deepened the sense of disorder that the attack had sown. In the days that followed, investigators, military officers, and civilian witnesses would speak of what they had seen, but the immediate experience remained anchored in the personal losses and the sudden rupture of a place once thought safe. In that way, the attack at Sand Creek was not a single, neatly contained event. It was a cascade of moments in which ordinary lives were interrupted, reorganized, and in many cases ended. The sounds and sights of that morning, the flags, the first shots, the scattering of people and animals, the desperate measures of those trying to protect their families, continued to shape the memories of survivors and witnesses for years to come. The chaos left behind was not only physical debris but a set of questions and grievances that would echo throughout the region. Once the immediate confusion subsided, what remained were damaged lives and communities struggling to comprehend what had happened and why. Immediate aftermath and shock. Hello, and thank you for listening. If you find this account meaningful, please consider subscribing for more history told with care. When survivors returned to the place they had trusted as safe, the scene they encountered undermined everything they had been promised. Black Kettle and other leaders had camped under a flag of peace, thinking that the presence and recognition of that emblem meant protection. Waking to silence that was not the calm of sleep but the heavy absence of life, families gathered what they could and tried to understand how a safe harbor could become the site of such deep loss. Word traveled outward from the camp in fits and bursts. Some of those first to leave carried messages, some carried children, and some were charged with burying the dead. Reports reached military posts and nearby settlements, where citizens and officials struggled to reconcile the reports with the rhetoric that had preceded the violence. Assurances of peace, treaties negotiated in good faith, and promises of support. In towns, people who had been anxious about raids and reprisals now felt something different, a stunned recognition that the rules and protections they had relied upon might not hold. Conversations that had been about frontier patience and policing shifted instead to questions about responsibility and honor. Survivors moved through a landscape changed not only by physical acts but by the collapse of trust. A number of families found shelter with friendly settlers or with other tribes, while others set out to join relatives in more distant camps. The immediate practical needs were plain. Tents and lodges had been destroyed. Food stores were gone. The cold was still coming. Winter would not wait for grief to subside. More quietly, but no less urgently, there was the task of tending to memories and mounting evidence. Leaders who had sought counsel with the army now demanded answers. Those who had favored accommodation with the white authorities felt betrayed. Those who had opposed it saw their fears affirmed. Among soldiers and volunteers who had taken part, reactions were mixed and often conflicted. Some offered triumphant accounts in the press and in letters home, eager to frame the attack as decisive and necessary. Others were unsettled. A handful of officers refused to carry orders and later testified about what they had observed. The refusal of some men to fire when commanded became a focal point in later inquiries. Their testimony would be vital, and it arrived while the charged atmosphere among local populations still smoldered. Within the territorial capital, conversations veered from celebration to concern as political leaders tried to manage a story that was rapidly growing beyond any single community. Newspapers played a complicated role in the days that followed. Some local papers ran dispatches that cheered the action and framed it as a blow to threats of violence on the plains. Other publications, both within the territory and in the eastern press, published accounts that questioned the conduct of those who had led the attack and highlighted the human cost. Letters from witnesses and affidavits from survivors appeared, and the tide of public opinion began to shift. The press, which had earlier amplified complaints about raids and claimed a need for forceful action, now carried details that demanded accountability. Editors in the East, far from the immediate pressures of frontier politics, debated how to reconcile reports of slaughter with the nation's professed ideals. Official scrutiny followed quickly, as military authorities and civil officials convened to collect statements and document the scene. Officers who had been stationed nearby wrote accounts criticizing the operation. Some commanders urged investigations. There were dispatches between Army headquarters and territorial authorities that asked for clarifications and statements, and those communications formed the backbone of later hearings. The nature of those early inquiries helped shape the public record. Testimony was gathered, declarations were taken, and a chain of written evidence began to map out what had happened. For many observers, the contrast between the formal language of reports and the rawness of survivor testimony underscored the inadequacy of routine military protocols to address the moral dimensions of the event. Political leaders and citizens in faraway cities struggled to process the news. In some quarters, officials called for strong measures to restore order on the plains. In others, the event provoked calls for protection of those who had been under promises. The contrast between rhetoric and reality echoed in halls of power, where debates over policy, responsibility, and military command were suddenly illuminated in stark terms. Elected representatives and newspaper editors who had previously endorsed vigorous campaigns against bands perceived as hostile were now faced with the problem of conduct by their own forces. The national conversation shifted from abstract strategizing to the specific question of how and why a community living under a recognized symbol of protection had been attacked. For the native communities directly affected, the immediate emotional toll was profound and layered. There was, first, the practical sorrow of mourning and of attending to survivors' needs. Then came the deeper psychological shock, the realization that a place of refuge had been compromised, that even gestures of peace might not be honored. Elders and parents confronted the ruin of long-held hopes for peaceful coexistence. Children, who had been spared years of open hostility by careful diplomacy and by dependence on the promises of others, suddenly faced an uncertain future. The displacement that followed disrupted seasonal movements, hunting patterns, and the rhythms of daily life. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to repair. Acts of remembrance began almost immediately. Family members and neighboring tribes gathered for quiet burials and ceremonies. Where possible, bodies were attended to according to custom. The scale of the loss meant that not every family could perform the usual rites for every person. Some graves were simple and hurried. Others were marked and visited in later years. Oral accounts and songs that spoke of the day were formed almost at once, passing the story from one generation to the next. Those testimonies carried details that formal reports could not, and they preserved perspectives on the event that would later help historians and descendants understand the human dimensions of the tragedy. Legal and military consequences unfolded slowly but unmistakably. Witnesses who had refused to fire, officers who had recorded objections, and civilian officials who had seen the aftermath provided statements that laid the groundwork for formal investigations. Committees and boards reviewed the conduct, and their reports circulated in both official channels and the public sphere. The findings were complex. Some authorities condemned the behavior of those who had led the operation, while political realities and local loyalties complicated efforts to bring legal penalties. The career paths of those implicated were affected in different ways. Reputations were stained, some men were hailed by partisans, and others escaped formal punishment despite censure. The tension between local sentiment and national legal standards made the path to accountability uneven. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate survivors and military personnel. Settlers living in nearby regions confronted the implications of the event for their own safety and moral standing. Traders and missionaries who had developed relationships with native communities felt particularly shaken, recognizing that long-term bonds could be undone by a single violent episode. Political leaders in the territory faced the challenge of calming a populace that wanted reassurance of safety while also responding to growing demands for justice. The event cast a long shadow over relations across the frontier, deepening mistrust and hardening attitudes on both sides. In the months that followed, retaliatory cycles of violence increased along some parts of the frontier. Leaders who had once sought accommodation reconsidered their strategies. Warriors who had been hesitant to take up arms were drawn into broader conflicts, and communities found themselves caught in a widening circle of reprisal and response. This did not come as a simple chain of tit-for-tat acts. Instead, the event reshaped alliances and altered the calculus of survival for many groups. What might have been a localized tragedy became a catalyst for larger military and political campaigns. Voices of conscience emerged and were remembered. Men who had refused orders to participate in the attack spoke openly about their feelings and about the moral lines they believed had been crossed. Their testimonies, recorded in official hearings and in private letters, provided crucial documentation. They described the horror of seeing non-combatants harmed and the difficulty of reconciling that with orders coming from superiors. These accounts offered moral clarity to some observers and unease to others, and they helped fuel demands for formal examination of the operation. The public memory of the event shaped subsequent conversations about policy and ethics on the frontier. For some, it became a symbol of the dangers inherent in unrestrained military action. For others, it became a contested episode used to justify various political positions. Communities that had survived the attack guarded their memories with reverence. Families that lost loved ones passed down stories that ensured the event would not be forgotten. Over time, historians and descendants drew upon the immediate aftermath, the shock, the testimonies, the inquiries, and the personal accounts, to construct a fuller understanding of what had been lost and why it mattered. In the end, the immediate aftermath was not just a series of logistical problems to solve. It was a rupture in relationships and expectations, the beginning of a long reckoning with broken promises, and the moment when the true costs of frontier conflict became painfully visible. The days and weeks after the attack were filled with grief, interrogation, and a search for meaning. For those who lived through it, the shock endured long after bodies were buried and reports filed. It became part of a community's identity and a sobering lesson passed down through generations. Investigations and public reaction. When reports of a dawn attack on a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment reached the territorial capital, shock and disbelief moved faster than the official cables. Hello. If you find this history important, please consider subscribing for more careful looks into difficult moments. The first wave of formal inquiries did not wait long. Military officers, territorial officials, and later national legislators opened their files, interviewed witnesses, and gathered sworn statements. Men in uniform were called to account. Survivors were brought before committees. The record began to take shape through testimony, not rumor. Soldiers who had been ordered into action and those who had refused to follow certain commands furnished the most immediate evidence. A handful of officers refused to be silent. Their names would be remembered because they spoke plainly in depositions and hearings. One officer testified that the victims had raised a white flag. Another described seeing non-combatants among the dead. Their accounts were careful and often blunt. They set out times, routes, and conversations. These were not abstract accusations, but concrete recollections intended for jurists and lawmakers. Civilian witnesses, including miners and local settlers, supplied a different tone. Some travelers stopped at the site and brought back reports to newspapers. Some recounted only what they had heard, while others pointed to the bodies and to the ruined encampment. The press, both regional and national, amplified every voice. Eastern newspapers that tended toward humanitarian reform published scathing editorials. They framed the event as a moral outrage. In contrast, many local publications and territorial leaders initially framed it as a military success, or as an unfortunate but necessary act in a brutal frontier contest. The split in coverage made the public debate raw and immediate. Investigations proceeded on multiple tracks. Military officials responsible for oversight dispatched inquiries to determine whether orders had been lawful and whether the use of force had exceeded any bounds set by military instruction. Congressional committees later examined the broader political responsibility of territorial officials and militia leaders. Testimony came from three broad groups: military participants, territorial authorities, and other civil officials, and survivors from among the Cheyenne and Arapaho. That inclusion of indigenous testimony was rare for the era and altered the shape of the findings. The testimonies of survivors described not only the assault but also the presence of non-combatants, the raising of a distinctive flag, and gestures meant to indicate surrender or peaceful intent. Their voices introduced a human dimension that words alone could not conceal. Evidence was corroborated in often mundane but convincing ways. Troop rosters showed which companies had marched. Letters and dispatches revealed the orders given before and after the operation. Photographs and sketches of the aftermath, respectful, restrained images, were circulated among investigators and editors. Doctors and surgeons provided medical affidavits, noting wounds and the care attempted. The military reports weighed all of these materials: official correspondence, sworn statements, and the on-the-ground observations of men who had been there. Investigators confronted contradictions and sought consistency. Some soldiers recanted earlier confessions of pride. Others stood by the facts they had reported as eyewitnesses. Public reaction outside the immediate theater of the conflict crystallized in newspapers, sermons, and civic gatherings. In many eastern cities, ministers and moral reformers condemned the action in stark terms. They called for accountability and for official redress. Civic leaders urged that those responsible be disciplined. In the territorial press, local meetings praised the troops and urged calm, citing the precariousness of frontier life. This gulf between regional and national sentiment pushed political leaders to take visible steps. It also revealed how memory of the event would be contested for years: heroism in one place, atrocity in another. Political fallout reached into councils and executive chambers. Territorial leaders faced sharp questioning about the orders they had issued and the messages they had sent to volunteer units. In legislative hearings, officials were pressed to explain their decisions and to account for public statements that may have inflamed the situation. Some were criticized for inflammatory rhetoric. Others were faulted for failing to restrain volunteer units. The inquiries did not simply allocate blame, they parsed responsibility: who had the authority to give and to rescind orders, who had the duty to protect civilians, and how far local prejudices had influenced choices made in the field. Legal remedies were limited despite condemnations. Investigators found culpability and described actions that, by prevailing standards, exceeded acceptable military conduct. Still, prosecutions were rare. The political reality of the frontier, coupled with the standing of some officers in local communities, complicated efforts to bring formal criminal charges. Instead, the official findings were made public and used to censure reputations. Military reputations suffered. Some leaders were publicly denounced, and a few lost future advancement. The lack of criminal prosecutions left a bitter sense of incompletion among many critics and among survivors. The testimony of survivors proved especially powerful in shaping public memory. Their accounts were often gathered with the aid of interpreters and sympathetic officials. They spoke of the same small details that corroborated soldier witnesses: flags, gestures, the presence of children. These narratives were quoted in testimony and printed in sympathetic periodicals. For many readers, they supplied an urgent moral frame. This was not simply a clash of arms, but a failure to protect those who trusted assurances. The moral weight of these accounts pushed some moderate commentators to call for more systematic protection of treaties and for reforms to military oversight on the frontier. Grassroots responses were varied and meaningful. Families of victims sought reparations for lost livestock and property. Some communities organized benevolent aid for refugees pressed into new camps, trying to provide blankets and food. Religious organizations in the eastern states arranged collections and sent delegations to witness conditions and to press for official remedies. Meanwhile, veterans organizations and territorial veterans insisted that soldiers had acted under orders and demanded that their actions not be criminalized. Public ceremonies, some of remembrance, some of celebration, began to mark the event differently depending on perspective. Memory was being forged in real time. The national government, confronted with conflicting local pressures and clear evidence of wrongdoing, chose to make the investigative record public. That transparency mattered. It allowed citizens to weigh testimony and created pressure for administrative changes. Military procedures governing the use of volunteer militias and the reporting of civilian casualties were scrutinized and, in some instances, revised. Scholars and later historians would point to these investigative transcripts as a turning point in how the nation tried, imperfectly, to hold itself accountable for actions on contested frontiers. Even years after the investigations concluded, public debate persisted. Commemorative acts and municipal resolutions reflected evolving public sensibilities. Some towns that had once celebrated the militia quietly suppressed celebratory rhetoric. Descendants and communities sought recognition and redress. At the same time, other descendants of those in the militia passed down stories that framed the attack in terms of security and defense. This divergence of memory kept the event alive in civic life, prompting periodic re-examinations in papers, in classrooms, and in courtrooms. The legacy of the investigations was mixed: a set of official findings that condemned conduct, a public outcry that forced political reckonings, and a stubborn absence of full legal reckoning for all those responsible. Yet the process itself, collecting testimony from soldiers, settlers, and survivors, publishing reports, debating publicly, changed how such events were discussed in the Republic. It created a precedent for public inquiry into wartime conduct on the frontier and for acknowledging the voices of those who had been harmed. In that sense, the investigations and the public reaction together formed a record that neither sentiment nor time could entirely erase. Long-term consequences for the region. During the 19th century, the Great Plains were a place of collision between competing visions of land, livelihood, and power, and the events at Sand Creek became a pivot point whose effects rippled across that landscape for generations. Hello. If this account resonates, please consider subscribing for more histories told with care. The immediate slaughter at a Colorado encampment did more than leave bodies in sorrow. It fractured treaties, accelerated dispossession, and reshaped politics, economy, and memory across a wide region. A federal investigation the following year condemned the attack as unjustified and castigated the militia leaders involved. That formal rebuke did not translate into meaningful legal accountability for those who planned and carried out the assault, and the absence of punishment mattered. Public debates in the region hardened around differing views of security and settlement. Territorial politicians and private interests who favored rapid expansion seized the moral ambiguity left in the wake of official censure to press forward with land claims, military forts, and infrastructure that favored incoming settlers. That momentum made the promises embedded in earlier agreements between indigenous nations and the federal government more fragile than ever. For the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples, the long-term consequences were immediate, persistent, and deeply material. Survivors were scattered and vulnerable. Communities that had relied on seasonal cycles of hunting, trade, and diplomacy found themselves pushed into fewer and more constrained spaces. Many who had hoped to maintain a degree of autonomy were compelled onto reservations, removed from traditional territories and resources. The collapse of bison populations, driven by commercial hunting and railroads, intersected with dispossession to produce a severe collapse of subsistence options. Food scarcity was followed by dependency on federal rations and the bureaucratic systems that administered them, creating new points of leverage that shaped daily life, governance, and family structures for decades. The massacre also changed the tenor of military strategy and intergroup relations across the plains. Retaliatory raids and reprisals proliferated, and the cycle of violence hardened attitudes on both sides. The United States Army increased its presence in the region, and commanders pursued more aggressive campaigns against groups perceived as hostile. This change in posture fed into a broader pattern of the Indian Wars, an era defined by punitive expeditions, enforced relocations, and confined reservation life. One immediate human echo was the fate of leaders who had survived the attack. Notably, the Northern Plains leader who had sought peace and yet been caught up in the violence later perished in another campaign, a reflection of how the logic of force moved beyond a single site to touch many lives. Regional demography and economy shifted in ways that favored settler communities at the expense of indigenous livelihoods. Land that had been used communally or seasonally was parceled, sold, fenced, and brought into farming and mining economies. Ranching expanded, rail lines carved new corridors, and mining camps became permanent towns. Those changes created a new economic geography. Towns and territorial capitals swelled. Markets for livestock and mineral wealth drew labor and capital. For native communities, the loss of grazing and hunting grounds meant not only reduced food sources but the erosion of cultural practices tied to land stewardship and mobility. The uneven economic development that followed left a legacy of dispossession and economic marginalization that persists in many forms to this day. Culturally, the massacre inflicted wounds that were both immediate and enduring. Oral traditions preserved the memory of what happened and transmitted grief, anger, and survival strategies across generations. Languages, ceremonies, and kinship networks were strained by displacement and by policies that sought to assimilate children into boarding schools and new religious orders. Those policies sought to remake identities and to sever ties to ancestral lands. Yet, despite these pressures, tribal institutions and cultural life adapted and endured. New forms of political organization emerged within displaced communities, and alliances among tribes shifted in response to the altered landscape of threats and opportunities. The legal and political ramifications reached beyond the region. Congressional hearings and public outcry produced debates that influenced federal Indian policy in Washington and the corridors of power in the territories. Lawmakers were forced to wrestle with how to respond to frontier violence when militia actors were local power brokers. The failure to hold perpetrators fully to account set precedents about enforcement and responsibility. In turn, indigenous leaders used the record of assault and investigation as a source of testimony in negotiations, petitions, and advocacy for rights, compensation, and recognition. Over the long arc, that record contributed to later efforts by tribes to reclaim voice in national conversations about sovereignty and reparative justice. Memory and public history in the region took a long time to reconcile with what had happened. 4 decades after the events, silence, minimization, and contested narratives prevailed in local and national textbooks and memorials. Later generations of descendants and allied historians worked persistently to recover fuller accounts, to document testimony, and to create spaces where sorrow could be acknowledged without spectacle. In later years, joint initiatives between tribal representatives and government agencies produced markers, educational programs, and protected spaces intended to honor the dead and to educate visitors. Those memorials function as both sites of grief and as civic reminders of the consequences of lawlessness and broken promises. Environmental consequences, while less often foregrounded, were also long-lasting. As settlers converted prairie into farmland and introduced new species, the ecological contours of the region altered. Loss of habitat for migrating herds and the transformation of water systems changed the seasonal patterns that indigenous communities had relied upon. That ecological shift in turn reinforced the social and economic displacements already underway. In effect, the landscape itself became part of the mechanism of removal. Generational trauma and social consequences have had measurable effects on health, education, and economic well-being. Intergenerational studies and community observations point to elevated rates of social strain in populations that experienced forced removal and cultural suppression. Conversely, cultural revitalization movements have demonstrated resilience, producing language programs, ceremonial renewals, and legal strategies that reclaim space within the regional polity. Those efforts have reshaped how communities imagine their futures, sometimes reclaiming land, sometimes pressing for collaborative stewardship arrangements, and often demanding a seat at planning tables that shape development, conservation, and interpretation. Politically, the massacre left a legacy that complicates regional identity. State and local institutions that grew up in the shadow of the violence have had to confront uncomfortable truths as communities change, and as tribal nations press for recognition of their sovereignty and rights. Dialogues over land use, tourism, and education now frequently center on questions of voice and ownership. In some cases, cooperative management agreements have emerged between tribes and federal or state agencies for sites of memory and for landscapes of cultural importance. Those arrangements are part of a slow rebalancing of authority and narrative control, though they coexist with persistent inequities. Finally, the long-term consequences are visible in the moral imagination of the nation. Stories from the plains, of broken treaties and of attempts at reconciliation, have been woven into broader conversations about justice, historical accountability, and how a plural democracy confronts painful chapters in its past. Families and communities who trace their lineage to the events have become national advocates for truth-telling, for educational reform, and for policy change. The act of remembering has thus become both an instrument of healing and a tool for political leverage. The echoes of that day continue to shape the region. For descendants, historians, and residents alike, the landscape remains haunted by absence and animated by the ongoing work of restoration and remembrance. In many ways, the long-term consequences are not simply a legacy of loss, they are also a catalogue of responses, legal, cultural, political, and moral, that communities have mounted in the face of deliberate breach. The process of confronting those legacies is uneven and unfinished, but the conversations, memorials, and legal claims of recent decades show that history in this place is not static. It is contested, revisited, and, slowly, reimagined. Closing reflection and legacy. When a Colorado militia descended on a Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment that had shown signs of peaceful intent, the echo of that decision reshaped lives and lore across the plains for generations. Hello, and thank you for spending this time with a careful look at what has lingered long after the guns fell silent. If you find this account meaningful, please consider subscribing for more thoughtful historical storytelling. The immediate aftermath prompted investigations by military and civilian authorities who concluded that the assault had violated norms and orders, and that those who had been targeted were not the enemy they had been portrayed as. Survivors and witnesses recorded names, places, and descriptions, and those testimonies became central to later reckonings. Scholars and government reports would later assemble evidence showing a pattern of broken commitments and miscommunications that fed into the tragedy, and the record has been used repeatedly to study how policy and prejudice translate into policy failure. In the community circles of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, oral histories passed down through families kept alive the memory of who was lost and why it mattered, long before formal memorials were created. Memory did not remain private. Over time, the event entered public consciousness as a symbol of a much broader story: the failure of treaty promises, the pressures of settler expansion, and the human cost of contested sovereignty on the frontier. Museums, history books, and classroom curricula began to place the incident within a larger narrative about Western expansion and indigenous dispossession. For many educators, it became a case study in how to teach about moral complexity and institutional responsibility without sensationalism. For Native communities, it became a touchstone for cultural revival and a rallying point for legal and political advocacy. Survivors' descendants used the documented record to press for recognition, to reclaim artifacts and remains, and to protect sacred sites from development. Physical remembrance also took shape. Landscapes that had been the scene of trauma were gradually preserved and interpreted, and these places now serve as settings for ceremony, education, and respectful visitation. Interpretive centers and signage attempt to balance historical detail with cultural sensitivity, offering context about treaty rights, the social structures of plain societies, and the lived realities of frontier life. Archaeological work, undertaken carefully with tribal oversight, has helped clarify aspects of the camp's layout and daily life, and repatriation efforts have returned human remains and cultural objects to descendant communities. Those cooperative models stand as examples of how institutions and indigenous nations can work together on matters of memory and stewardship. Legal and political consequences followed. Military inquiries and later governmental reviews condemned actions taken on the ground and critiqued the policies that enabled them. Those findings influenced how later campaigns and reservations were managed and informed legal debates about accountability, sovereignty, and federal responsibilities. While no single policy shift erased the harm, the incident contributed to a longer process of legal reform and public debate about how the United States would fulfill, or fail to fulfill, its treaty obligations. The lessons drawn from the tragedy have been cited in discussions about the rule of law, the limits of military authority in civil affairs, and the need for transparent government oversight. Cultural responses have been wide-ranging and profound. Poets, historians, filmmakers, and playwrights have engaged with the event, not to exploit sorrow but to interpret pain, resilience, and the moral puzzles it raises. Community-led commemorations blend ceremony with education, and artists from descendant nations have created works that center indigenous perspectives. These creative efforts keep memory active in ways that straight historical reporting cannot, offering nuance, emotion, and the language of healing. At the same time, public debates continue about how to present the past. whether to emphasize systemic context, individual agency, or both. Those debates reveal as much about present values as they do about the past itself. Reconciliation has been slow and uneven, but it exists in pockets. Local governments, academic institutions, and federal entities have at various times acknowledged responsibility or expressed regret, and in some cases have worked collaboratively with tribal nations to create programming that supports cultural revitalization and public understanding. These gestures do not erase past harms, and neither should they be taken as substitutes for deeper structural change. Yet they are part of a process that has allowed descendants to tell their own stories in public forums, to name ancestors, and to hold annual observances that both mourn and affirm survival. Educationally, the legacy persists in classrooms where the episode is taught as more than a tragic anecdote. It is used to illustrate the consequences of dehumanizing rhetoric, the dangers of unchecked power, and the importance of treaty law. School curricula that incorporate Indigenous voices and primary source materials offer students a more complete view of frontier history than earlier textbooks provided. Law schools and public policy programs also study the case as an example of what happens when military and civilian authorities fail to coordinate ethically. The continuing inclusion of the event in academic syllabi and public education initiatives helps ensure that the memory informs contemporary debates about rights and responsibilities. There is also a cautionary institutional legacy. Museums and archives have had to reckon with how artifacts were collected and displayed, and many have adjusted policies to give descendant communities greater agency over interpretation and care. The rise of collaborative curatorial projects and co-produced exhibits reflects a broader shift toward shared stewardship. Those changes underscore a crucial lesson. Historical institutions are not neutral repositories but active participants in shaping public understanding, and thus they have responsibilities to do so with humility and accuracy. Finally, the human legacy endures in the everyday practices of remembrance that families and communities maintain. Names remembered in prayer circles, stories told at kitchen tables, songs sung at gatherings. These are as important to legacy as any monument. They connect present generations to ancestors in ways that statistics and official reports cannot. They also remind us that history is not merely an academic exercise. It is woven into identities, governance, and moral choices that continue to matter. In the end, what remains is less a tidy resolution than an ongoing conversation, one in which acknowledgement, education, and cooperative stewardship create paths toward understanding and respect. Hello, thank you for watching and sharing this time with me. We have followed a story of promises made and promises broken on the frontier, a community trying to live in peace under treaty assurances, a camp seeking safety and hospitality, and then an attack that changed the lives of survivors and reshaped history. We trace the context of rapid settlement and political pressure, the choices of leaders on both sides, the testimony that flowed afterward, and the slow, uneven work of memory and accountability. We looked at how official investigations exposed failures and how public conscience shifted, even when justice was partial and reconciliation long delayed. We saw how descendants and allies kept the story alive across generations, insisting that the past be remembered honestly, with dignity for those who are lost and care for those who remain. If this film has helped you understand a little more about how broken promises unfolded on the prairie and why that matters today, first invite you to stay connected. If you found value in this exploration, please consider subscribing, a quiet way to help more people learn these histories. Your comments and reflections are welcome. They help shape future conversations and remind us that history is not only a record of events but a call to listen and learn. To sum up the key points plainly, treaties and assurances mattered. They were often ignored under pressure and fear. The people who sought protection were not always protected. Official inquiries exposed wrongdoing, but legal and institutional remedies were imperfect. Memory and memorialization have been vital tools for healing, and the work of remembrance continues across communities, museums, and sacred sites. This is not just a story of a single place. It is a mirror for how a nation has struggled with its promises and the human cost when those promises fail. If you want to keep going with us, future episodes will delve into the wider arc of treaty making and treaty breaking, the lives and voices of leaders and families who carried these memories forward, and the ongoing efforts toward recognition, apology, and restoration. We plan careful archival research, conversations with descendants and historians, and visits to places of memory to bring those stories into clearer focus. Before we close, take a moment to imagine the landscape one last time. Tall grass moving under an open sky, a ledger of promises and a ledger of memory, names spoken aloud to keep them living. Honor can be simple: listening, learning, and carrying forward what we discover. Thank you again for being here. If this resonates with you, please like, share, and subscribe to help keep these conversations going. We will return soon with more careful histories and thoughtful stories. Until then, take care, and keep listening to the land and the people who remember.